tense geopolitical climate of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a relentless nuclear arms race, pushing for more powerful and numerous nuclear weapons. This nuclear arm race came at a devastating environmental cost that was and is still being felt throughout the entire globe. The unrestrained development and testing of nuclear technology from 1945 to 1990 resulted in widespread nuclear contamination that continues to impact the environment to this day. Today in this video, I will examine the major areas where nuclear technologies left a toxic footprint, ranging from environmental testing to nuclear accidents and the environmental impacts of the nuclear fuel cycle. So now I'm going to be talking about the nuclear age. That began with the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons by the US and the USSR. In the 1940s and 1950s, well over 500 nuclear tests were carried out, releasing immense clouds of radioactive particles and gases. And I have a video that kind of gives you a visual of how these gases and chemicals were released and kind of the scale of how they were released. Testing locations like the Nevada test site and the Marshall Islands in the Pacific became ground zero for nuclear fallout. However, the effects were not only confined to the test sites. Radioactive contamination was held by the atmosphere and dispersed globally through wind, contaminating specific areas based on wind patterns. And next I'm going to be showing you guys a map of fallout disbursement. So as you can see, this is a map of the United States, and you can see that from the origin of contamination, there's massive spread of harmful particles. This is a major issue because even if nuclear tests or uses were in a contained area where they were unable to affect anyone, their downwind disbursement spreads so vast that it is impossible to not come in contact with humans in sensitive environments, which can have huge impacts on the areas that they contaminate. And here's the origin, and you can see how it's dispersed throughout the entirety of the United States. And this has unprecedented consequences. By the 1960s, atmospheric testing was banned, but nuclear testing went underground and underwater. The US administered over 800 underground tests at the Nevada test site, while the Soviet Union conducted around 500 tests at Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. The next video I'm going to show you is an underground test taking place, and this video should give you a scale of the destructive nature of these underground tests. As you can see, the nuclear explosion completely swallows the ground, and it's kind of impossible to contain what's happening underground. While told to the general public that these underground tests were contained, underground detonations vented radioactive gases back into the air, and you could sort of see a little bit of that when the ground kind of comes up before it goes under. as well as contaminating groundwater. These explosions contaminated a lot of precious groundwater that's very vital to the ecosystems and humans that are dependent on it. The populations living downwind from the test sites received higher doses of radiation exposure, leading to increased cancer rates amongst other health complications. An example being the downwinders in rural Utah, downwinders being people downwind and exposure to nuclear contamination. Next, I will be touching on the environmental impact of these testing programs. Ecosystems like forests, farms, and marine environments were contaminated, causing devastating agricultural loss and cruel impacts on wildlife. In 1986, a study at the Nevada test site found a 90% reduction in species diversity compared to neighboring undisturbed areas. 90% reduction, that's a huge amount. And the places that it was being compared to were places that were unnuclear contaminated. This is such an issue because without the biodiversity that nature intended, ecosystems are unable to function and collapse, ceasing to exist altogether. And without ecosystems of the world, we also can't exist. So this is a huge issue. Next, I will be talking about the Chernobyl disaster. No incident demonstrates the danger of nuclear technology better than Chernobyl, which occurred in 1986 in Ukraine while under control of Soviet Russia. On April 26, 1986, a safety check at Chernobyl nuclear plant spun out of control, causing an explosion and a reactor meltdown that released critical amounts of radioactive waste into the environment. An estimated 5 million curies being the measurement of radioactivity, were released into the environment. Radioactive material including cesium-137, iodine-131, and strontium-90 were emitted from the shattered reactor over the course of 10 days. These radioactive particles traveled through the atmosphere, contaminating much of Ukraine and eventually dispersing throughout the entire northern hemisphere. This was a completely unintended consequence of this nuclear reactor, but it gives sort of a perspective on how dangerous this technology is and how devastating it can be if it goes out of control. And we can't always control nuclear energy and nuclear weapons production. So next I'm going to be showing you a map of the radiation spread from Chernobyl. Give you a chance to look at that. I'll explain what it means in a second. So the red that you saw were confiscated and closed zones, and the kind of lighter pinkish red that you saw were permanent control zones, and the even lighter color below that is periodic control zones. And the rest of the sort of yellowish orange are unnamed zones. And the colors from darker to lighter kind of signify how dangerous these places are and how much nuclear sort of contamination lies within that area. The repercussions of Chernobyl's meltdown were devastating in the regions surrounding Chernobyl. Hundreds of thousands of people had to be evacuated from the towns and villages even years after the accident, and the impact on the environment and wildlife was severe. Agricultural areas had to be abandoned, and the soil in them and the surrounding areas were contaminated. Wild habitats and forests were blanketed in harmful radiation that killed much wildlife and left others with disturbing radioactive-induced mutations. Next, I'm going to be showing you what some of these mutations that were induced by radioactivity sort of look like, and this should kind of give you a perspective on how dangerous this technology is if left unchecked. And the terrible impacts that it left on the environment. So as you can see, this animal has many deformities. It has multiple legs and is developed in a way that it definitely shouldn't have. Here's another example. As you can see, there's major deformities in this animal's jaw, and it's just not fair that stuff like this has to happen to the environment and wildlife because of humans' choices. These two photos also demonstrate and emphasize the unfortunate human-made consequences of nuclear development. Over 30 years later, parts of the Chernobyl exclusion zone remain uninhabited radioactive zones, which shows the scope and how long this stuff can actually affect the environment, and it never really goes away. Now and for years to come, Chernobyl will be in need of continuous monitoring and contaminant efforts. Although so much negative has come from the Chernobyl incident, we still may not know the full effect as radiation continues to persist and spread throughout different ecosystems. And like I was talking about, wind and weather patterns are a major spread of these nuclear particles, and that's why we can never really predict the full scope of the scale, because the radiation is always sort of spreading. Next, I will be talking about the nuclear fuel cycle. Aside from the nuclear weapons program and powerful plant incidents, the process involved in creating nuclear fuel itself caused persistent and severe damage to the environment. The nuclear fuel cycle begins with the mining of uranium, which is an extremely destructive process that has taken a tremendous toll on the environment and on indigenous communities. Next, I'm going to be showing you guys a photo of what uranium mining looks like, and you can see that it just destroys the environment and terraforms the land in a very negative way that makes it unable to be inhabited by wildlife, and unable for vegetation to grow. Over 500 uranium mines operated from 1944 to 1986 on Navajo lands in the southwestern United States. Groundwaters on Navajo lands were contaminated with radioactivity and dangerous heavy metals. Similar stories like the abuse of the Navajo and their lands happened throughout the United States. Even after mining, there were environmental releases during the milling, enrichment, and fuel fabrication, which are used in creating nuclear reactor fuel. With no permanent disposal solution, the immense quantities of radioactive waste created by the nuclear fuel cycle continue accumulating in temporary storage sites, one of many being Hanford, a nuclear storage site located in Washington. Although better contained, this is a temporary solution and poses the risk of future leaks, spills, and further environmental contamination. And that's one of the many dangers of nuclear technologies. There's really no way to permanently dispose of it. So it's always going to be an issue the more we create. Nuclear stockpile. The true amount of irreversible environmental damage done by the nuclear weapons production can be greater understood by looking at a graph of the amount and rate that nuclear weapons were created. So next I'm going to show you a few graphs of the production of nuclear weapons. As you can see, huge rises in production. By 1986, the United States and Soviet Union had amassed stockpiles of warheads reaching numbers greater than 60,000. The creation of these warheads was a huge economic and military investment made at the expense of the environment. So instead of helping the environment with government funding, we created more things that were harmful for it, and it was a huge expense. The tens of thousands of nuclear warheads that were created needed multitudes of materials to be mined, processed, and enriched through the destructive process of the nuclear fuel cycle. So not only are they destructive once created, but they have a destructive process in making them. As I have shown in this video, the rushed development of nuclear technology between 1945 and 1990 caused widespread and enduring harm to ecosystems, wildlife, and environments across the globe. From the nuclear testing sites in southwestern America and Kazakhstan, to the radioactive lands surrounding Chernobyl, to the uranium mines in indigenous territory, the painful lesson and legacy of this nuclear era is one that we are still struggling to come to terms with today.